Hey, everybody, welcome to Hearing God in John chapter 3, where I want to briefly share my Hear Journal with you, which means highlight, explain, apply, and respond. And there was so much to choose from in John chapter 3. Just as a bonus point, in the first half of the chapter, Nicodemus is meeting with Jesus. Nicodemus has questions about Jesus and what it is to follow him. And Jesus is quick to point out that to follow Jesus is all about new birth. It's about being born again, which is supernatural. And so, my first takeaway from this chapter is a reminder for myself and for all of us that we must never take the supernatural element out of Christianity. It is not merely intellectual assent and changing our minds about a doctrine. That there's a part of that for certain, but that's not all. It is a supernatural rebirth that takes place within us. We are literally made new creations in Jesus Christ. And so we must never take the supernatural element out of Christianity, and nor should we become uncomfortable when we talk about the supernatural in Christianity. When we do, we rob it of its power and we rob God of his glory. But my point for my Hear Journal today actually came out of the second half of the book, or of the chapter, and it is John the Baptist who was confronted with a difficult situation. John the Baptist had a prominent role for a very brief season in the kingdom of God, where John was baptizing people and preparing them for the coming of Jesus the Messiah. He accumulated a certain number of disciples who were following him. But now that Jesus was on the scene, rightfully so, those disciples were migrating from John the Baptist to Jesus. And John was confronted about that and asked, well, how do you feel about that, John? And it might be reasonable for us to think that John's feelings would be hurt, or that he would be jealous, or that somehow he would feel like he was being wronged in this. And in verses 27 through 30, John answered, a person cannot receive even one thing unless it is given him from heaven. You yourselves bear witness that I said, I am not the Christ, but I have been sent before him. The one who has the bride is the bridegroom. The friend of the bridegroom who stands and hears him rejoices greatly at the bridegroom's voice. Therefore, this joy of mine is now complete. And then verse 30, he must increase, I must decrease. And so, again, in context, when John was confronted about the prospect of having these disciples leave him and go to Jesus, John demonstrates this incredible humility. He understood his place in God's kingdom, and therefore he understood Jesus's place as high and exalted. And so John was simply a humble servant, not intending himself to be more important than he should be. I love that first explanation he gives. A person cannot receive even one thing unless it is given him from heaven. That tells me that John didn't have any sense of entitlement or think that he deserved to have a certain role or level of exaltation in God's kingdom. He was just a humble servant receiving whatever it was that God had for him. And that was my explanation. In my application, I just said, sometimes I wonder how I would have responded if I was John the Baptist. I'd like to think that I would also have been so gracious and humble, but I have my doubts. And the reason I have my doubts is I find in ministry and in life, I can be pretty thin-skinned, and I can be criticism stings me more than it should. Disappointments bother me more than they should. And a lot of that goes back to, I think, a certain level of pride and a sense of entitlement, and thinking that, well, as a pastor or as a Christian leader in God's kingdom, I deserve certain things. And I have to go back time and time again to that a person cannot receive even one thing unless it is given him from heaven. And then ultimately that verse 30, where John says, he must increase, I must decrease. Um, if I had to choose a life verse or a philosophy of ministry verse that I would aspire to, it would be that. Where, you know what, at the end of the day, if there's going to be any fruit in my life, fruit in my ministry, it must be Jesus and not Chad. Jesus must increase, I must decrease. Another translation says, he must become greater, I must become less. And that's just, it is a hard battle as a leader sometimes to constantly have to course correct and come back because, yeah, just part of leadership, I think at times is um, putting yourself out there, and putting yourself out there for people to follow. And it's almost expected sometimes that you have a vision and that you have certain things that people would want to follow in you. And that's true. But again, then we can be kind of puffed up and full of ourselves and not the example that John the Baptist was giving to us. And so, in response, they simply said, Father, put me in my place today as a humble servant who gratefully receives what I am given from you and is content with that. Truly, you must increase and I must decrease. And so I think that's true not only for a pastor, a spiritual leader, it's true for all of us. Are we going to be able to be content with what we have received from the Lord and aspiring for Jesus to increase and for us to decrease? So hopefully that's an encouragement and a challenge for you today from John chapter 3. Look forward to joining you soon for John chapter 4.